That is his cousin Jack. Jack is your age. That is Jack's personality to this day. Jack is all go and very active. And then Tate is on the other side, his older cousin and his younger cousin. So I don't know what they're doing. I know they're at my mom's house. I can tell that, but I don't know what they're doing. So that has nothing to do with Esther. I assume I put that up there. Wayne, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. I'm not really, but I love you. That's true. So we talked about Esther yesterday. We talked about the conundrum of Esther, how different it is from all the other books of the Bible, that it's not typical. It has no, one quote says that other than the fact that the story is about the Jewish people, there's nothing Jewish about it at all in the religious sense. The characters are flawed, and we're all flawed, but I mean really, truly flawed characters. The author makes no judgments on that. It's not like this was bad or this was good. It was. So Esther has been ignored by many theologians over the course of the millennia. But it's there for a reason. It's there for the same reason all of the Old Testament is there. From Romans 15:4, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. So it's here to give us hope. And indeed, I hope you will find that this book of Esther does give you hope. I talked to you about the history that these people in the story of Esther were those that had chosen to stay in exile, to stay in Persia. This is about 50 years after they were given permission to go back to Israel, and these people stayed. Now, if you think about it, they were in exile for 70 years. So most of them knew no other way of life than in exile. And so while the Jews that chose to go back were laboring and struggling to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, the people in Persia, the Jews of Persia, just lived like they had all their lives. So we talked about the people involved here. We've got King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, and that the big theological question of the day is, are we still God's people? Obviously, the people that returned weren't asking that same question, but these people were. So I talked about the major themes of Esther. I'll go through that real quickly. The major theological point is that God fulfills his covenantal promises to his people through his providence. We'll talk more about that. And then there's some other themes, including banquets and celebration and feasting and a sudden turn of events. So here's the point of Esther. The story of Esther, and I know that I'm still reviewing, that's okay. The story of Esther is about an event, which was a decree of death that was supposed to bring about the destruction of the Jews, but because of a sudden turn of events, it actually resulted in the destruction of their enemies. The Jews were delivered rather than destroyed. So here's what Karen Jobes says about this. The author is suggesting that beneath the surface of even seemingly insignificant events, human decisions, and events, an unseen, uncontrollable power is at work that can be neither explained nor thwarted. Because this story is in the canon of the Jews and subsequently the Christians, it's proper to construe that unseen power as God. What is the divinely inspired author of Esther trying to say to his readers about God? So now we pick up where we left off, which is at the theology of Esther. And I mentioned to you yesterday that God's providence, the theme of God's providence, is at the heart of this book of Esther. And God's providence is a theological concept. And God's providence is, and again we see, well, there you go. I didn't need to do that. So this is God's providence. God in some invisible and inscrutable way governs all creatures' actions and circumstances through the normal and ordinary course of human life, without the intervention of the miraculous. Now, I don't know if you remember this story, and I don't know if you even remember 10th grade, but we talked about providence and what providence is. No, this is 11th grade. When we're talking about miracles and providence, I know you remember it all. I told you the story of being at Kmart. There was a Kmart in Bellevue. That Kmart was on the hill where that big Bellevue University building now stands. And I had gotten a morning to myself to go shopping, and I don't know, I was young and stupid. I decided to spend it at Kmart. There was no Walmart at the time. That's how long ago that was. And we had this old beater van, and I went and to unlock, no key fob. We didn't have anything like that. The first time we got a key fob, it was like, wow, we've really gotten into the high life now. And so I go and I turn it, and I hear it unlock, and I take it out, and it's locked. So I turn it again, it unlocks, I get in. I turn left out of the parking lot, I go down to the light at Fort Crook Road. And my light is green. I'm looking up ahead, my light is green. And just before I entered that intersection, a car comes flying by. What if my car would have walked the first time? Probably would have been right in the middle of that intersection. That's fine. Maybe. Miracle? I don't know. No, don't unlock it. I don't know. But probably God's providence in my life. And that is how God most often works, not through miracles, but through providence. So this is a theological concept that we see throughout Esther. Of course, God can and does work miracles, but he also and primarily works through his providence. Remember the theological question of the day that we talked about? Are we still children of the covenant? Are we still God's people? The books of Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is when the temple is being rebuilt. Nehemiah is when the wall around Jerusalem is being rebuilt. The Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah and others confirmed the answer to that explicitly for the Jews who returned to Israel. Of course, they were still God's people. They were working to restore Jerusalem. But what about the people that chose to stay in Persia? The story of Esther is one in which God fulfills his covenantal promises to his people not through miracles, but through everyday, ordinary events. And don't miss this. Not only did God, through the events recorded in Esther, say, yes, you are still my people, but it was these very scattered Jews in Persia that God used to protect and preserve the Jews who had returned to Israel. Because that decree of death was for all Jews everywhere in the Persian Empire, and that included Palestine. And so the book of Esther is all about God's providence. God may seem hidden, but he is not absent. Dr. Ian DeGood says, as in everyday life, God's intervention is everywhere visible in the book of Esther, even though his presence is concealed. Dr. Jobs says this. The book of Esther is the most true-to-life biblical example of God's providence precisely because God seems absent. Even in the most pagan corner of the world, God is ruling all things to the benefit of his people and to the glory of his name. Even when his own people, like Esther and Mordecai, make decisions that come from ambiguous motives at best, or perhaps even outright disobedience, God is still providentially working through those very things to fulfill his covenant. So I find great comfort I can't mess up God's plan. I can't mess up God's plan for me, for the world. I can disobey. I can experience discipline for that. But God can and will work out His purposes in the world. I find comfort in it. So this book has a lot to say to us. It has a lot of contemporary significance. It's a powerful story. It's still read and treasured in synagogues worldwide. They read it aloud on Purim, and the kids all have noisemakers. And every time Haman, you'll find out who Haman is mentioned, they boo and they hiss. And every time Mordecai or Esther are mentioned, they cheer, and it's a wonderful celebration. And I love that because this people who so many different evil rulers have tried to destroy, they obviously find great comfort in knowing that God will not allow them to be destroyed. So its contemporary significance for the Jewish people was outlined by the late Jewish Rabbi Robert Gordis. He said this, he wrote this: Anti-Semites have always hated the book of Esther, and the Nazis forbade its reading in the crematoria and in their concentration camps. In the dark days before their deaths, Jewish inmates of Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, and Bergen-Belsen wrote the book of Esther from memory and read it in secret on Purim. Both they and their brutal foes understood its message. In every age, martyrs and heroes, as well as ordinary men and women, have seen in it not merely a record of the past deliverance, but a prophecy of future salvation. And it is indeed a prophecy of future salvation. Stick to it. Oh, there it is. So it is indeed a future salvation. The book of Esther points to Jesus. Remember, I've told you before that the entire Old Testament is a neon sign saying Jesus. And so it ultimately points to Jesus. As Dr. Karen Jobes puts it so eloquently, Jesus, I think I wrote this down here, Jesus took on the death that was our destiny so that we could have the life that was his. It's the greatest turn of events in all of history. The deliverance from earthly death described in Esther points to the greatest deliverance from eternal death, won for us by Jesus. We also see as I've mentioned before, in Esther, the hand of providence. Esther tells us that God fulfills his covenantal promises to his people through his providence. And he is still at work through his providence in our lives, communicating to us his ever unfolding will for our lives. We see it in our faith stories. You probably have stories of events and people that led you to Christ, or that led you to a particular decision, or that led you here. My father was a 3-star general, the deputy chairman of the NATO Military Committee, and he was given an assignment to Turkey, which would have made him the highest-ranking military official in Turkey. It was a 1-year assignment. I was going into my junior year of high school. My sister was in college in Minnesota. And my 2 younger sisters, one was in middle school and one was in elementary. And had he taken that job, he most likely would have been there for a year and pinned on a 4th star, and I don't know where he would have ended up. I've always wondered where he would have ended up, on the Joint Chiefs. I think the commander-in-chief was SAC. I don't know. We've been told by the Secretary of the Air Force, that they had plans for him. But that move wasn't what was best for his family. And as I've told you before, I was far from God. I was making decisions that I would never even tell you the details of that were awful. And I was unhappy. And so my father saying to my mother, the fourth star wouldn't be worth it if we lost him, chose to retire and move us back here. We could have moved to D.C. They owned a house in McLean, Virginia. We could have moved to Albuquerque. My father always wanted to move to Albuquerque. But ultimately they decided that Bellevue was the best place to raise children, and so we moved here. I'd been here for middle school, for part of middle school, for part of 7th grade and all of 8th grade at Mission, and I made a lot of friends. None of them good friends, mind you. I was really adept at finding not good friends. And I yelled at my parents, and I was angry at them because they were moving me from Nebraska to Europe. 2 years later, I yelled at my parents and became angry with them because they were moving me from Europe to Nebraska. I was a junior at Bellevue West. First year that Bellevue West was open. First year there were 2 schools, and what do you know? All my friends from middle school went to these. I had no friends. And for the first time in my life, I was lonely. I went to school. I went to whatever practice was that season. And I went home. And it was that loneliness that drew me to God. I had no idea what happened to me. Had my father taken that job in Turkey, I know I would have been at a boarding school away from home for a girl who wasn't making very good choices. God's hand of providence over my life. Decisions that other people made. Decisions that Bellevue Public Schools made to build a second high school. All played a hand in my coming to Christ. We see it in the chain, we see God's providence in the chain of events that lead us to any number of decisions. And I know I've told you this before too, but I am here because my best friend had the guts, and she had never done this before, had the guts to look at me as we sat on a beach near Tampa Bay and say, Amy, get out of the boat. God put you on the planet to teach. You need to be teaching God's word. That led me to teach Bible studies at my church, which led me here. Apart from Chrissy's movement, I might have missed out on this. Teaching at Cornerstone. God's providence. We see it all around our lives. And I would invite you to consider, what are your stories of God's providence? So we see this in our lives. Everyday, ordinary events. A move to Nebraska. A trip to the beach. We can lay our plans, our best made plans, if we wish. But Proverbs tells us that the Lord orders our steps. He can, and he often does, thwart our best laid plans because they're not what's best for us. Jeff and I have a saying. We say when something comes out of the blue, we say, life is what happens while you're making other plans. That's God's providence. Another reason I love this story, and another thing that it shows me, is that Esther, this story is just like us. That God is in control of our lives. So this story of Esther hits us, or at least it hits me, right where I'm living. Esther couldn't see the happy ending where she was standing outside the throne room of the king. But the truth is that it didn't depend on her anyway. Here's what Karen Jobe says again. God's triumph in history ultimately does not depend on what we do, but on what he does. It depends not on our character, but on his character. That's true for us as well. I remember when we sold our house on Lloyd Street. I remember we sold it by owner. And Jeff worked, and I was a stay-at-home mom, so I knew it would fall on me to sell this house. And I felt like, what if I screw up? What if I don't do it? Because I was showing the house, and I remember reading about God's providence during that time and realizing, literally, I couldn't screw up. God had this. By the way, we got fully asking price for that house, so God did a good job. And friends of ours actually bought it from us. So God's providence, God's will doesn't depend on us. It depends on, or our character, it depends on him. And then one of the things that just jumps off the page with Esther is that God is not absent. Although God's name is never mentioned in Esther, he is not absent. Nor is he absent in the deepest, darkest days of our lives. In fact, Karen Jobe writes that the great paradox of Esther is that God is omnipotently present, even where God is most conspicuously absent. I love that. But then she points out that Jesus' last words to his disciple in Matthew 28, just before his ascension, were, "Go and make disciples of all nations, and surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And then ironically, he left. But he was still with them. And the truth is, he is with us. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever prevent him from bringing us safely. That is a truth that we will see over and over again. And my prayer is that as we study this book together, as we dive deeply into this book together, that it will be meaningful for you as well. Okay, now, the way we're going to run this time is going to look like an elongated skula. So this is the introduction into Esther, and now I have questions on Esther 1. We'll discuss those tomorrow. Next week, we'll have a lecture on Esther 1, and we'll go through Esther that way. It should take us, well, we have some days off coming up. But before the mission trip is over, we should be done with this. So these are the questions for Esther 1. These are due tomorrow, but you do have the rest of the hour, about 10 minutes, to begin working. You can work together in groups. I would like for you to do that. I think you get better answers when you do that, when you discuss it. But you can work on your own if you wish.